Now we have from Aoyama Gakuin University, Professor Takashi Inoue. It's titled Migration Models and International Marriage Migration. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Inoue from Aoyama Gakuin University. And thank you to the organizing committee, National Institute of Population and Society Security Research, for organizing this conference. Now, I will be talking about migration models and international marriage migration. So the labor force migration model and the models on international marriage migration does not match, but I will be talking about those models. So the migration is one of the themes of this conference. So migration is both geographical and social moves. And usually it is used to show geographical movement. And geographical move refers to change in usual residence. So it just means generally moving from one place to the other. So I will be mostly referring to the change of residence. And what is migration model? The model, well, it is a bit different in nuance from the Japanese model that this conference is talking about. My model is about mathematical model, and this model aims to explain what factors cause migration stream that flows towards certain direction. And the migration model that I'll be talking about does not categorize the internal domestic migration and internal migration. So we do not really focus whether it is an internal or external or international migration. So we're just talking about migration in general, what it means when a person moves from one place to the other. So the model migration is a labor force movement model, and I will talk about the rationale. This is a model migration schedule by a very famous person, Rogers. I am looking for a pointer. So Rogers talks about this migration model, and on the far right-hand side, and the x-axis is age, starting from 0 to 80, 100 years of age. And the y-axis is migration rate. So with age, the migration rate changes, and Rogers explained this with a mathematical model. And this model can be decomposed into 4 parts. The biggest triangle is the labor force component. From age 15 to 60, the production age population moves around. Then the pre-labor force component is a small triangle, and post-labor force component is after retirement migration, and this is constant component. So as you can see from this diagram, with age, the migration rate changes, and most of that change can be explained by labor force. One of the big cause of movement is labor. So regardless of whether it's a domestic or international migration, majority of migration is labor migration. So I think we can call this model a labor migration model. And there are three causal factors of labor migration. What causes migration? So there are three elements, and one is distance friction. Second is population size. Third is economic gap. And those factors are common among the labor migration. And above the three, 1 and 2 determine the size of migration extreme, and the third factor determines the direction of migration stream. So it's a regional economic gap model. Now, what is the gravity model? This determines the size of migration between region and another region. So Mij equal K multiplied by P1 multiplied by Pj divided by Dij. Pij is a population of a region I, Pj population of region J, Pij distance between region I and J, K a constant, A a constant. So this is gravity model. Between two masses there will be forces applied, and that equals the population multiplied, and Dij also includes distance measured by time or economic cost. So this population of region, if they are bigger, then of course the M will also be bigger, and the distance, if it's longer, then that it becomes the distance friction, and Dij is the distance, and this usually refers to physical distance, but also sometimes it is time distance and cost distance. Time distance means the time taken to travel between the two distances. The cost is the cost incurred when traveling between the two places. Now, the third model is the economic gap model. So the model determines the gap between the scale of migration Mij that flows from the region I to region J, and the scale of migration Mji that flows from region J to region I among migration scale between region I and region J. So the distance from Mi and Mj, and also the reverse distance that can be explained by some factors, as was also touched upon in the morning presentation. People usually migrate from the weak economic region to strong economic region, and this typical migration that can be explained by this model is migration between urban and rural. So people usually move from rural, weak economic region to a stronger economic urban region. So the labor migration leads to several models, and in the international migration, and also there's also a developing countries labor model that is famous is Todaro model. Regional economic gap model uses real economic indicators such as wage gaps and gaps in job openings to appliances ratio between regions. model that explains rural-urban migration in developing countries is explained by the gap in expected wages between the two areas. So a person in rural area, if he moves to a formal sector in urban area, he expects he will be earning a more wage. But in developing countries, most of the people who have moved from rural to urban area cannot earn that much of wage. So this reality is leading to excess movement from rural to urban. And the Todaro model is also applicable to international labor migration as well. So migration that cannot be explained by migration model, by labor migration, is the family network, family migration. There are several types of family migration. There are such as the chain migration and international marriage migration. Chain migration is migration caused by social networks. So these are mainly migration based on family network. And I took up the international marriage migration as my research topic, and I'll be explaining about that. Here is international marriage and international marriage migration. International marriage refers to marriage between two people who have different nationalities. And most of the international marriage involves international migration. And usually migration and marriage involves some time lag. This is important, and what this means is as people get married internationally, they migrate, and because they have different nationalities, so the person who has already moved to some other foreign country may marry a person from that country. In that case, the international marriage doesn't coincide with the international migration. So that's what I mean by time lag. So in my migration research, what I focused was hypergamy and hypogamy. What I mean is generally marrying to someone who has higher social status, income, and education is called hypergamy, and the reverse is called hypogamy. And regardless of advanced country or developing country, women tend to want to climb up the ladder more than men. So hypogamy is defined as marrying to someone from a country of higher economic level. The reverse is defined as hypogamy. So usually hypergamy or hypogamy is refers to individuals. But when I use this term, what I mean is whether marrying a person of a higher economic level country or not. That's what I mean. Now please look at this table 1. So with that kind of a definition, I looked at the 4 types of international marriage between two countries. And type 1 means the husband who comes from a higher economic country. That means hypergamy from women's perspective. And second is wife comes from a higher economic country, and type 3 means the husband who comes from a lower economic developed country, and type 4 means a wife who comes from a lower developed economy. So now, as I mentioned, women wants to climb up the ladder, so I think we see the most of the international marriage in type 1. This means, and type 2 is less than type 1, and type 3 is the most small in number, and type 4 we see more than type 3.
So, based on this hypothesis, I wrote a paper in 2010. Now, let me define BG ratio. Now, a bride in one country marries the local person who is of foreign citizenship. Then what happens is that, so type 1, type 2 ratio. So that's BG ratio. BG ratio. Now, I have developed this hypothesis. So you see this hypothesis, and consider BG ratio between two countries, country I and country J. Assume the level of economic development is higher in country I than country J. And BG ratio of country I to country J equals the reciprocal number of BG ratio of country J to country I. So based on this table 1, I'm going to explain about Japan and Korea. So Japan is at higher economic level. So this is Japan, and here type 3 is Korea. So type 3 against type 4. So that should be coinciding with each other. That's my hypothesis. And in fact, if we look at the transition of international marriages between Japan and Korea, this is what happens. Here it says Korea, but actually including North Koreans as well, not just South Koreans. So Koreans from Korean Peninsula, and also include the residents in Japan of Korean origin or Korean citizenship. So it's very difficult to distinguish these different types of the so-called Koreans from North and South. So just for the sake of simplicity, I lump them together. So this is 2000 to 2011. So the international marriages, that's the Japanese-Korean international marriages. So for Japan, BG ratio is this is the husbands, Korean husbands. So 2.48. That's BG ratio. And Korea, Japanese wife and Japanese husband. If you take those two figures, so BG ratio is, you know that you have to take in the Korean case the reciprocal number and see the ratio 2.60. And then if you compare Japan and Korea BG ratio or the BG reciprocal number, then this is what happens. So this shows a comparison between BG ratio of Japan to Korea and BG ratio of Korea to Japan. And you see the correlation is 0.881. So it shows a strong correlation between the two ratios. So I believe that this is evidence to support my hypothesis 1. Now, as for hypothesis 2, let me introduce to you. So this is both BG ratio of country I to country J and BG ratio of country J to country I change with the level of economic gap between country I and J. And this implies that as the economic gap between country I and J narrows, BG ratios of both countries get closer to 1. When the economic gap completely disappears, BG ratio of country I to J equal BG ratio of country J to I equal 1. So this is based on the hypergamy and hypogamy. When there is no gap, then the same condition, then BG ratio should be close to 1. So that's the gist of the hypothesis too. To verify this hypothesis, I have tried to come up with per capita GDP in Japan and Korea, and the comparison or the ratio is shown here. As you can see, as a trend, around 93, the Japan and Korea, the ratio was around 4.2, but recently it's 2.0. In other words, that shows that it is evident that the economic gap between the two countries is shrinking. So this is based on per capita GDP. And this shows the per capita GDP ratio trends. A blue line shows a per capita GDP ratio. And in 1990s, it was end of 1990s. No, not. It's actually at that time when there was the Asian crisis, it goes up, and then after that, as a major trend, it shrinks. So against that, Japan's BG ratio and the Korea 1/BG ratio is shown in red and green lines. So as a general trend, it's all going down, and it's difficult to identify clear correlations. However, in the next figure 4, BG ratio, you see here, it's try to stretch it to the left for 7 years extended. And then we see a correlation. As you can see here, BG ratio, when I extrapolate to the left, then it means it considers time lag. So as I said at the outset, international marriages actually should accompany time lag against the actual migration. So that the timing of international marriage and these figures appearing, there might be several years of time lag. That's the reason that I have extended this a bit. And it makes sense, I believe. It may be coincidence, but per capita GDP ratio, this trend, and Japan-Korea, the BG ratio, and also the reciprocal number changes or trends can be interpreted more clearly. So what it all tells us is that the implications from trends in international marriage between Japan and Korea can be concluded. So BG ratio of Japan to Korea and the reciprocal of BG ratio of Korea to Japan are related. So this supports hypothesis 1. And these figures are related to GDP per capita of Japan and Korea with some time lag. So this perhaps supports hypothesis 2. So based on these observations, I conclude that there has been many economic models and labor models. It used to be the preconception that it was difficult to explain labor migration model. Using labor migration model, it is difficult to explain the international marriage migration. However, perhaps that is not true. It is highly probable that international marriage migration may be explained by a labor migration model. So, as you can see, these are the factors that we need to consider in labor migration model: policy-related factors, historical factors, social and cultural factors. There are factors that are not usually included in the labor migration model. So these three factors should be revisited, examined, because they could be quite influential factors. And actually, these factors are more influential on international migration, it is fair to assume, and especially the based on our discussion so far, proves that the policy-related factors include the immigration as well as the entry policies. All these quite influential, major perhaps factor for international migration. And especially the first factor can be a major cause of international migration through immigration policy and immigration control policy. Now, then, prospects of international migration from and to Japan. As the globalization and bloc economies proceed, policy-related historical, social, and cultural barriers are expected to become smaller. My theory is that the policy-related barriers, historical, social, cultural barriers, are expected to shrink. That's my theory. And as I have heard from other experts so far, the TPP, EPA, these are the negotiations ongoing. So that could result in the liberalization to a certain extent, at least, in the area of labor market. So it means that these barriers could, relatively speaking, shrink compared against the past. So the large proportion of international migration from and to Japan may be explicable by changes in three causal factors of labor migration. Now, this is the prospect of international migration from and to Japan too. Now, the distance friction factor promotes migration as distances in terms of time and cost decrease as international aviation networks and low-cost carriers expand. In other words, this could instigate increased volume of migration with the ease and low cost of migration. So you see here, this should shrink, this formula, DIJ should shrink, and then MIJ should, to the contrary, increase. That's the assumption, premise. Now, as for the actually prospect I, Japan, population is bound to decrease, and the PI, small. The other, the counterparts, population may increase, may not. So as far as the population scale factor, this is neutral influence. It has no relevance, since even though as population of other countries increase, population of Japan would decrease. And now, as for the economic gap factor, it promotes international migration in both directions, as economic gap between Japan and other Asian countries are bound to decrease. So Japan is not necessarily going to stay as an accepting country of labor, but rather it could be the opposite as well, sender of labor. Now, next, the third perspective about the international migration from and to Japan. It is expected that scale and direction of international migration move toward a level that matches population and economic scale of Japan. So far, we have been arguing that against the population and economic scale, Japan's international migration scale is very small. However, we could assume that perhaps international migration, as far as Japan is concerned, might try to match up more into the future. And in that sense, Japan model might accelerate and could become closer to the international model as Japan tries to close this gap so that it can be more aligned to its economic scale. So the fourth perspective is policy-related historical, social, and cultural factors may promote international migration. If immigration and immigration control policies effectively utilize Japan's traditional culture, sightseeing resources, social capital, and science and technology. So Dr. Ishikawa mentioned about the retirement migration. That is outflow from Japan. After or upon retirement, Japanese could migrate to other countries. However, in view of the solid infrastructure that can ensure quality of life in Japan, perhaps we could also encourage to develop policies to promote to choose Japan as a place after retirement for overseas affluent people, and also medical facilities and quality of the medical services is very high in Japan. So in that sense, it is possible for Japan to promote the introduction of the more or less affluent overseas potential migrants to come and live in Japan, especially after retirement. So this could be a policy to capitalize on the Japan's superior infrastructure and also culture. So quality-wise, I think Japan model in this context could be viable model. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Inoue.